All right, so welcome to another episode of the Thrive podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Garbett, and joining me today is an award-winning astrological author, researcher, and teacher, Kerrie Redgate. So Kerrie is an exceptional purpose specialist and a researcher who has spent the past 35 years developing an innovative system of astrology for designing meaningful careers and sleuthing out subtle self-sabotage. She does this by uniquely using thousands of asteroids to investigate past life influences, focusing on her clients' birth charts from the point of view of their spiritual consciousness, rather than their habitual ego mind. Kerrie has also been investigating the science behind astrology in the hope that this system may one day be accepted as an extraordinary and valid science of consciousness. Having taught comprehensive 2-year courses in astrology, in Sydney in the 1990s, Kerrie is currently preparing a series of online courses and a book series that will be rolling out later this year. And Kerrie, I'm really looking forward to your books being released later this year. I've been keeping an eye on your website and we've been in contact via email, and yeah, really looking forward to that one that's launching later this year. So
that's great.
Kerrie, Kerrie, thank you for joining me on today's show.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, and it very much so, and I'm very excited to get into this talk today because I've done a few sessions with you now, and you know my curiosity was on like overdrive when I first reached out to you. Like you know, I've been exposed to a couple of things in my own awakening or my own journey, and I got recommended by a psychic that I saw one day. Her name was Rhonda, and she recommended I go see you. And it was something that I was always curious about. Like, you know, I understood a little bit of astrology, but I would, like, after speaking to you, it was only just scratching the surface, and it was almost looked like a completely different field because my understanding of astrology was, you know, the horoscopes that I would read out of the paper or my star sign and things like that. And after seeing you for your big view session, it just really blew me away at the amount of information that you could, you know, almost pull out of the universe or out of the stars from the moment that I was born on this planet. So really excited to dive into that today and, you know, unpack it even more so I can have a better understanding of it. And not only that, the listeners as well.
Oh, great. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah. So I think the first place to start is, like, you know, could you explain what astrology is? And like, I guess for quite a lot of listeners, it may be something that they haven't been exposed to before, or if they have, it may have been just that exposure that I had, being the horoscope in the paper. So how would you explain like astrology to a total newbie or someone that hasn't had much understanding of the field?
Well, it's first of all, it's got nothing to do with those sun sign columns. That's the first thing I always have to start with. There's so many people think that's astrology, and it's not actually. It was invented. That system was invented, I think, in the early 20th century. It was just a way of making money, I think, for an astrologer, selling it to newspapers and things. But so unfortunately, it's given astrology a bad name. So astrology is a really ancient science, and it's an ever-evolving science because it changes with our human consciousness. Our understanding of life, the universe, and everything changes as we develop our own consciousness. Astrology becomes richer and richer and richer, and it's actually a science. Just to put it very simply, it's the science of how all of the influences in the solar system, it's got nothing to do with fixed stars out there in space. It's all happening inside our solar system with the sun and our planets, etc. And it's the way all of those influences impact the Earth's electromagnetic field, and in particular, the ionosphere of our field. And those frequencies, it's all based on little frequency waves. Those frequencies are picked up by the brain because, unfortunately, in the West, we have this, or we've been taught really, that we view reality through the 5 physical senses, which is the sight and touch and sound and hearing and the smell sensation as well. And we think that's the entire world. And there's a small little spectrum of energy that the left hemisphere really analyzes and puts together as a picture of reality. And we've all been given this great lobotomy because we don't realize there's a whole other right brain here, and also other brain centers that are picking up frequencies beyond those 5 physical sense consciousnesses and those 5 physical sense realities. This is something the Buddha figured out a long, long time ago as well. I mean, he was amazing. He was an extraordinary psychologist, really, 2,500 years ago. But of course, he didn't understand the brain because people didn't know anything about the brain 2,500 years ago. But he certainly nailed consciousness and psychology. So what's happening is that the brain, the whole brain we have inside our head, is a gigantic receiving dish. And this is something that science hasn't recognized yet. And it's something that's obvious to me as an astrologer. As it works, I can put different planetary frequencies together, their radio waves, etc. I can match those to brain areas, and even brain areas inside brain areas. It's like Russian dolls. You can sort of go down and refine it further. And so so astrology is really the science of understanding how those it's the logic, really. Astrology is logic. It's the logic of how those frequencies impact us as human beings, and sometimes animals like cats and dogs too, and primates have very strong reactions to these things as well, and how we actually utilize those frequencies and what they're triggering in the brain. And it's a little bit like, if you think about, you can be having a really lovely happy day and you can walk into a shop where they're playing a really sad piece of music, and suddenly your whole emotional energy just drops, and you start feeling a bit, or it could be a song that reminds you of a lover you had once, or something who's not in your life anymore. Something triggers an old memory or something, and our whole mood changes. But what is music? Music is, it doesn't even have to have words in it. Some of the greatest music you find in movies that are so emotionally compelling, and they change your mood. They make you excited or sad or scared, it doesn't need any dialogue even, because music is vibrational frequencies. They're pressure waves of frequencies in the air that go into the ears and operate all the little sort of hairs and follicles and things inside the ears. And the brain knows how to interpret those to create what we call sound. And so if music can change our mood, well, so can the frequencies in the Earth's field. It's the same thing, but it changes more than just mood. Music's really good at affecting us emotionally, and it's a very internal process. But there are things in the Earth's field that can impact individuals and whole generations of people at once, like the slow-moving planets, because they don't move very far in the course of a whole generation of people, especially around up to 30 years. It impacts all of those people in that generation with that imprint in the brain. That's from the astrology side. But then I've got all sorts of other things we can talk about that relate to how I've actually proven that reincarnation really works. And I've proven that it doesn't matter what religion people may be, it doesn't make any difference at all. It's just the way consciousness works. So you can still have religion, you can still have all those beliefs, but there is a way that the Mindstream, as we'll talk about later, the way that sort of develops from one life to the next. And it's only the physical body that dies. And so consciousness never dies. And the interesting thing with consciousness is every single thing that we experience in life, in all of our lives, stays in that mind stream. So if you go and watch some really horrible movie, that's going to be there 5 lifetimes from now. You've still got the memory of that in there, and it might ping at different times if through different triggers,
Wow.
So that's a whole other big subject we can get into. So astrology really is just the logic, but the difference of the way I see astrology, because a lot of astrologers still believe that the star constellations out there are creating the zodiac sign. And they're actually not, because for one thing, I had an interesting story from one of my students years ago. She must have missed the class when I was explaining all of this about the zodiac, and she went to the planetarium with a friend, and the astronomer there was showing them the night sky, and he said, "Now there's Jupiter in Virgo right there." And she said, excuse me, no, sorry, it's not in Virgo, it's in Libra. And this is an astronomer, what am I doing? And he said, no, it's in Virgo. See, there's the Virgo constellation right there. See those stars there? She said, no, it's in Libra, it's in Libra. And she said, it's in the ephemeris. It says right here, it's in Libra, And they had this big argument. So she came back to the next class and she said, what's going on? And I said, well, we don't use the stars as our zodiac. But most astrologers just go along with it because they've never thought to figure out, well, what are we using? So it has nothing to do with anything that's way out in other galaxies. Some of those stars are other galaxies, and also in a constellation, the stars can be hundreds of light years away from each other. They look like they're next to each other, but they're not. They're vastly different. Because ancient peoples, when they looked up at the sky, it looked like a flat canvas. It looked like a screen on our laptops. They just thought it was a flat canvas and everything was just moving exactly next to each other. They didn't think that it was deep. They never thought it was deep like an ocean, So it's a whole other thing. So I've had to do this big investigation because I'm one of those, but why people. I drove my mother nuts with, but why? But why is that? But why is that? And I would go down.
I think that curiosity is important.
It is. It really is. And you've got to also be able to let go of old beliefs when you're researching something. Is my premise with research has always been to try to disprove any theory that I have. The first thing I do, I don't try to prove it, I try to disprove it. Because you can keep proving things and they'll keep happening and like, oh, that works until one day it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then you suddenly think, oh, it's not 100% right, But if you try to disprove something straight away, you just cut through all of that wasted time and you can see straight away, oh no, it doesn't work 100% of the time. And if something doesn't work 100% of the time, to me, then it's not a truth. It's not a reality. It's a convenience, but it's not a reality. Yeah. So that's how I've done my research with all of this and trying to figure out what it is we're doing. And that's when everything came back to the Earth's field, because the Earth's field is the filter that's sitting right all around the Earth. It's amazing, and it sings different songs. There are some sounds on my podcast. I actually have some sounds from the Earth's field, as well as sounds from Saturn and sounds from. I think I might have some Jupiter in there too. I think from memory.
That's amazing.
And it's amazing, and they come from NASA. So these are the radio waves of the planets that are hitting the ionosphere. And they've had to change the octaves and the hertz levels to get it to our hearing capacity, because we can't hear it. Obviously, I would be hearing it now. But it's really interesting that the Earth's field often sounds like whale song. And sometimes it sounds like the birds chirping at dusk or dawn. It's amazing. It's almost like the whales are singing the Earth's field to us. They're putting it through the oceans. It's really interesting. They're picking it up and playing it through. I'm getting goosebumps on that even as I speak. So they're like reinforcing it in an audible way for all the fish in the oceans. And it's quite amazing. And even the birds. So it's extraordinary, but we're very limited. People don't realize how limited human beings are. Dogs can hear sounds we can't hear. Birds can see ultraviolet light. They can see the ley lines in the earth that we can't see, which is why they know where to fly, to go north or south or whatever. They follow the lines, so it's really interesting. So, but we can open up a lot more of what I call the spiritual consciousness, which encompasses everything. If we can just get back into things like meditation. That's why meditation is not a 5 sense reality experience. You're in another space with that.
So would you say that, like I know you said earlier that, humans have been conditioned to live out of that 5 sense reality. However, a lot of these messages that are coming through from the ionosphere actually trigger like different areas of the brain. And would you say that when a person cleans up things like their diet, reduces stress in their life and regulates their nervous system and practices things like meditation and really down regulates and have that mental clarity, would they be able to tune in more so to those frequencies that are coming through that ionic?
I think so, actually. I think they would, because the way I struggled for years and years and years to try to figure out what is the ego. Because we have this sort of psychological attitude to the ego. And I thought, what is ego and what is spiritual consciousness? And why is there a dichotomy there? Why are there two things? And it took me a long time to try to figure this out. And I've never said this before publicly, so this is an exclusive for you. Right, guys. But I'm writing it's part of one of the books I'm writing about this. But I've come to the conclusion that the ego nature is actually the hard wiring in the brain from when you took your first breath. And that sets all the wiring in the brain, all the synaptic connections that create all our reactions to things, etc. And that particular brain neural net is actually a representation of where our mind was at the time when we died, like what our beliefs were, what our reactions, how we saw reality. So when we die, we're all through life, because the brain is plastic, they know now in terms of it. It's the neuroplasticity is about the brain constantly changing. You can even create new neurons if you like. So it's much more what's the term? Malleable or whatever. Yeah, something like that. It's very adaptable. It's like you can mold it any way you like. You can develop one skill and not develop another. But people tend to lose some skills if they develop others. So it's a trick to sort of get the whole brain working. But I realized that that's what the ego is, and the ego is habitual. And so when a frequency in the ionosphere comes along and triggers that part of the brain, most of us through life, we just react the way we always have, the way we did in our last life. And it's like that movie Groundhog Day. We just keep repeating the same scenarios over and over and over again. You know, you watch people in bad relationships, they get into another bad relationship and another one. It just goes on and on and on until something gets so bad, they stand back and they say, I have to change this somehow. And then they go and seek therapy or something. Yeah. So it's we sort of fall into that comfortable zone, but the spiritual consciousness is actually the part of us that is trying to rewire the brain. It's coming into the crown chakra, and this is what you get with meditation when you have those aha moments and those realizations, and you start seeing things differently. Even in life, you start reacting to things differently when you do a lot of meditation, because that spiritual consciousness, you're allowing it to come in and remold everything. And so you start changing the brain consciously, and you can start looking at the habit patterns, and you can think, I'm not going to react that way anymore. And it's like, I remember one time I had a big awakening in a relationship once when I was younger. I had these sort of like emotional habits in arguments and things, and I would just be like really stupid, you know. And this man was a very mature man and very solid, a lot of Virgo in his chart, and he looked at me and he just said, "Oh, Kerrie," as if to say, "That's beneath you." And it was like a slap in the face. I suddenly thought, "Oh my God, he's right. What am I doing?" And it's like I suddenly had this big awakening, because he was looking at my spiritual consciousness and saying, where is this coming from? That's amazing. And I didn't even know that pattern was there. You know, it's one of those things where we don't see our own patterns. But that kind of really woke me up, because he was speaking to my spirit. If he'd sort of come at me with all these barrels of, you do this and you do that, which is what we tend to do in relationships, like counterpoint, 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 I would have just dug my heels in as that little egocentric sort of stupid little girl, and I would have just railed with some more. But because he was speaking to my spirit woke up. It's like he switched my spirit on by relating to my spirit instead. And meditation does that just within ourselves. It switches different circuits on, because we have these different brain areas that are all interlinked, but they all come from different parts of our consciousness, which is really quite fascinating. And there are different planets up there when they come through certain frequencies in the Earth's field, and those frequencies are changing because of the tilt of the Earth and the spin. And there's a lot of things that create the zodiac in all of that, as well as times of day that Chinese medicine knows a lot about, and the ancient Egyptians did as well. They understood every 2 hours there's a different sign that's quite predominant, a different frequency in the Earth's field, which is why acupuncturists will say, you know, it's a good time to work on this meridian at this time of the day and this meridian at that time of the day. So there's a resonance happening all the time. So it's quite profound. So the ego, I think that's what the ego is. So when we talk about ego, it's not this horrible part of us, it's something, it's just our habitual nature that's coming from the last life, and the brain in the last life was molded from the one before that. So there's this thread there that comes through of things that we haven't cleared yet. And so
and would you say like, this is just something that's coming up for me now, would you say that the ego mind is something that because I know you said it's almost like that timestamp or that imprint of your last life when you come in. What's your perspective on I'm not sure if you've heard of like the imprinting phase that they say for children between like 0 and 7 in their life, where they start to pick up and adopt these behaviors unconsciously from their parents, for instance. Would you say that sort of compounds or adds to their egoic mind as they're developing, or would it be some form of karmic contract that they've agreed upon to be in that place in this lifetime? Does that make sense?
Well, it's very interesting. I think Steiner was quite right when he was looking at the first 7 years of life as being different from the next 7 years, etc. He had that sort of worked out as well. And what I found is because I've got, I mean, this is a whole other thing just to preface this with, but I've got a whole stack of my old past life birth charts because I've had information from mediums. And then I had a wonderful kinesiologist who I met, who was sort of that was a real karmic agreement thing, because a psychic had told me I'd meet this particular person, but she didn't say what she just said she'd be really important for your work, but she didn't say how. Yeah. So she turned up, and we used kinesiology to get the birth dates, places and times of my previous lives that related to the one the psychic had told me about back in 1987. And everything just was perfect. The charts were perfect. And now as my asteroid list grows, which I'll talk about later, I've got more data that actually confirms the things in those lifetimes. And what I discovered from all of that is that the first 7 years of our life represent, it's like a symbolic replay of our last lifetime in a nutshell. It's like the whole thing is a replay until we get to the age of that 7 to 8 period. And this is to do with the cycle of Saturn. And Saturn makes a 90-degree angle to where it was when you were born. It travels a quarter of the way around that zodiac sort of frequencies, the 12 frequencies, and it gets to that 90-degree angle. Suddenly the little ego sort of awakening comes out when little kids start actually relating more to this life as they're seeing it. And then the ego's reactions are there really strongly, but they're not repeating exactly the last life. And to give you an example, an extreme kind of example, because I've looked at situations of people who've had like abused childhoods, especially those first 7 years, whether they were just physical violence or sexual violence or whatever. And there's always a past life condition in their birth chart that is about probably being murdered or blown up in a war somewhere, or some extreme violence that they suffered and that killed them in that last lifetime. Now, they can't come back into this life and be murdered at the age of 5 or 6 or something, because then you used to be stuck in that cycle. So what happens is they end up having some kind of a power struggle with a force bigger than them, which is an adult, in order to have something to process as they go through life, so they can work through the terror of that as they start getting older. And otherwise, if they came in with a beautiful clean slate, with a lovely warm childhood and everything was fine, by the time they got to the age of 14, if someone like pointed a finger at them and threatened them with something, they'd just fall apart. They'd probably kill themselves. It would be too much to deal with. So it's an awful way for us to process things, but that's just the way it works. That the first 7 years, little kids are back in the limbic system of the brain. They're not up in the front of the brain yet. Generally, there is one generation who's broken through that, which is the Gen Z, an amazing generation. But most kids, they're just living in that limbic system brain, which is purely symbolic. It sees everything in a symbolic kind of tone. It's always free associating things. And so, if you take a doll away from a little girl, she'll scream and scream and scream because you've just taken her child away from her last lifetime, or a significant life she's working on. So that's why little kids are so emotionally volatile. And we don't realize what they're processing. And it happens very early on. It happens even from birth sometimes. It's an amazing thing. So when a little baby's being born with the, the cord around their throat, and it's like, oh, I don't want to do this. This is going to be really hard. They want to get out of it. They change their mind at the last minute. I don't want to do it.
I think this would be like a beautiful segue, because I know that you've mentioned a couple of times on the podcast today, and I know it's something that you've brought up in our sessions as well, about like this thread of or this Mindstream, or this thread of consciousness. This Mindstream, like where does that originate? Like, if it's something that streams on from life to life, if we were to travel back, backwards in time, like what is its origin? And knowing its origin, is there like an end goal, or like a destination that this mind stream's moving towards, or is it something that's continually expanding, continually learning, continually experience different elements of life?
Well, there is actually a goal in a human sense, and this is because this is still open to conjecture, because there are different viewpoints on this. But the Buddha, when he was talking about this, it's like it's endless. It's just this endless stream, because he got to the point of realizing that none of the things around us are actually solid and real. And if you look at quantum physics, I mean, this is not a pen. My brain's manufactured this as a little pen, because of the different things that I relate to from all the lifetimes and lifetimes of working with a stick and working with a quill and working with all kinds of different things that we relate with. But none of this looks the way we think it does. But so the mind stream is, like he says, it's eternal. It just goes on and on and on. And there are some really interesting channeled books, actually. Some people in the States, and also this woman who gave me the past lives that that were very important for me to study. And I think there was another group in Perth, and they all connected up and found they were getting the same information. And there was a very high sort of group of beings who were coming through who said that we actually move up when we finished our human existence. And I'll get to what that end goal is in a second, but when we finish the whole human existence, we then join up with other consciousnesses who are part of our kind of team, if you like, and we move up the ladder to a higher oneness. He said it's a bit like a little single-celled amoeba looking up at a human being and saying, how can all those cells be one person? You know, when I'm one cell and I'm perfectly fine on my own, you know. So it's a little bit like that, but then they have other, it's just like, they call it the Tao. It's just the Tao. It's the oneness of everything, you know, and the universe, I believe, is consciousness. It's all alive and conscious. And it's something that we tend to want to pigeonhole, and because we have a left brain that says, I know this because I know that, and I know dark because I know light, and you can't know darkness if you don't know light. So we have this dualistic consciousness that separates everything. And there's also a wonderful, if a lot of people have seen it, but if they haven't, there's a wonderful YouTube video by Jill Bolte Taylor called My Stroke of Insight. She was a neuroscientist and a researcher, and she woke up one morning and had a stroke in her left hemisphere, and she lost the ability to even recognize numbers or dial a telephone. And she said she was trying to dial a telephone, and she describes it fantastically. She was totally living through the right brain, the right hemisphere, because she'd lost the left one in that moment, and everything became one. And she said her arm was merging with the telephone, and she couldn't make a distinction between them because it's just energy. You know, the right brain picks everything up as energy and light. And you know, when the brain is triggering a certain area, it lights up. You know, there's literally light that is produced by consciousness. And so it's a very interesting description of that the left brain separates everything, the right brain brings everything together as sort of one whole energy. You know, and that's why the right brain's very Neptunian and very Piscean in its kind of evolution, and the left brain is more mercurial, more Gemini-like. And so when a Pisces person walks into a room, they don't say, oh, that's a nice cup. Oh, I really like that lamp. They'll just go and they feel the whole space. You know, they go, oh, this feels really great. You know, they just see it like a painting. You know, it's all one thing. It's like one energy. Whereas when you get types they're very left brain people, then they'll look at all the details. You know, they're looking, like the Virgo types do that too. They'll look at all the little details and they'll see things. You know, so even in paintings, oh, look at the way that little thing just sits next to that. And the Pisces person's where? You know, so it's really amazing. But I had a really, I don't know if some people would find that, they probably think I'm really crazy, but I'll tell you this amazing experience that I had with a friend of mine who passed away last June, actually. And he was a very old soul. He was an award-winning author, and he did a lot of work with nature. And I had a lot of correspondence with him during the last weeks that he was dying. And about a few days after he died, I was up really late working on a chart or something, and I was so exhausted. And I just put my head on the pillow. And he was a nature photographer as well. And I put my head on the pillow, and you know when you're in that state when you're not quite asleep, but you're just about there, you know. And suddenly I saw right in front of me with my eyes closed, I saw this circle, which I later realized was a camera lens. And he was showing me, it was like lying on the grass and looking at the grasses and some flower stalks and some flowers sort of at that angle. And he was showing me what they really look like. And there were these amazing like stalks of, it was like a lotus, because there was a pond nearby the place where he died. And there were all these long, tall grasses and this long stalk with a flower bud on the top, because I'd given him flower essences as well. So he knew I was very tuned to flowers. And the stalk was actually, there was shimmering golden light. It was all shimmering golden light. And there was a red light, a red ray running up and down through these stalks. And I thought, oh, of course, because red is like the opposite color to green, because the plants soak in all other colors and give us the green, which is the color of equanimity for our hearts, which is why it feels so good when you walk into nature, you know, because of that lovely green color. So they pick up the red, which is the life force, and that life force feeds us and gives us all kinds of healing modalities and all sorts of things from the plants. But this shimmering light, it was amazing. And then he moved the lens across like this a bit further over, like he had this camera. And the camera was him giving me the clue, again, trying to get into my limbic brain so I could see that the camera was the clue, you know, to what we were looking at. And I thought, oh, and I was so tired. All I could say was, thank you. And I couldn't even say his name. I was so tired, but he knew. But he knew he could catch me in that moment when my ego brain was going to sleep, you know, and the spiritual part of the brain was more alive. You know, so it is amazing that's when we look up at the stars in the sky, they don't even look like that. Galaxies don't look the way we think they do, because we create technical instruments to make them look the way we would want to see things. You know, so we have to see everything in a 3D kind of a, you know, shape. It's set. We have to separate everything, but it doesn't look anything like that. I mean, you ask a little single-celled amoeba, what does the moon look like? You know, it'll say, what moon for a start? I mean, it doesn't always look the same, you know, and I think dogs, have a lot of the blue spectrum. I think I've read. I don't know if that's still true, but apparently they see everything with a blue tinge. Yeah. So, and that doesn't mean they're wrong. It doesn't mean we're right either, you know. So who's to say their eyes aren't more accurate than ours are, you know? So we only have 3 color rods in the eyes, really. You know, we've only got like television sets and things. We only have 3 colors, and we mix all the colors from those 3 colors. So, you know, and it's quite fascinating. But there is, I think, in terms of the Mindstream, I think there is a human evolution in the Mindstream, and that does have a beginning. And where we came from there is open to conjecture, as whether it was from the Tao and we broke up into separate pieces and decided to experience this thing in a human form. But every lifetime builds on the next. And when people have their first human lifetimes, excuse me, they're usually in, I don't think there's any left on the planet now, but they're usually in very extreme tribal situations where they have a shaman who's an old soul who guides them, and they're learning about survival. They're learning about food and shelter. I mean, what's this physical body? I have to feed it. What? It goes to sleep every now and then. What's happening? You know, so it's like, it's a whole other thing. So we go through all this evolutionary process as we go through in the Mindstream. The Mindstream is a thread of memory. That's all it is. It's just a thread of memory. And when you tap into your spiritual consciousness, and especially through things like meditation processes, you start to remember things. You know, and little kids, because little kids are not in that left brain or the prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain yet, they remember, but we don't bother to ask them. You know, I mean, when I was 4 years old, that's my very first memory. I was about 4 because I could string a sentence together logically, but I was young enough so that I didn't have that left brain getting in the way. And I remember being in a room full of adults, and it was some sort of celebration. They were smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol. And I was looking up, like it was like a big sort of oppressive city of people. And I remember tugging on the trouser legs, and I said, there are children in India who are dying and starving, and we have to help them. And people looked at me like I was nuts, because, I mean, in the 1950s, we didn't know anything about India. We didn't even have television then. And no one ever spoke to me about India. And the fact that I even knew the name of the place was a bit bizarre. And I had this, and I was incredulous that these people didn't care, because now I know that I was Anglo-Indian in my last life. I was raised in London, but then I became a medical doctor and went to India with other medical doctors to try to alleviate the smallpox pandemic. So I was vaccinating people against smallpox. That's what I did in my last lifetime. And I did that for 7 years till I succumbed to a disease myself, which I think was just the grief and the shock of the poverty after a lifetime of privilege. I think it was a bit much. But so as a little child, and especially dying young and not finishing everything I wanted to do, I sort of felt, you know, that I had to get this message out. So little kids will often say things or do things, and if you really watch them, you'll see what they're doing, you know. So it's another friend of mine had a little boy who used to have this little blue car. He had to have this little blue matchbox car, and he kept crashing it together with another car. And she said, why do you keep doing that? Like he was being really violent. And then he was about 4, and she took him for a nice little trip in a car wash one day. And as soon as the foam came up, he started screaming and screaming, get me out, get me out, get me out. She said, we can't get out. He said, get me out, get me out. And he was really screaming. And then she told me about it. And I said, racing car driver. He died as a racing car driver in a blue car. You know, so that's why he keeps crashing the blue car. He's trying to process it. And the foam came up. And what do they do when a car crashes and it catches on fire? The foam, you know. So little things like that, if people would watch their children and watch what they react to, they would get a really good picture of what's going on with them. And it actually helps them then to guide them as they get older, and to know where to tread lightly and to where to give them more positive affirmations about the way things can be different now, that it's not the same life. So childhood stuff is really important, I think. So that's another book somewhere down the line.
Definitely. I think everything that we've spoken about is its own topic in itself so far. But I think that's so interesting. I've had friends of mine who have told me about their experiences with their children, and again, it was around that 3 or 4 years old. He's a friend of mine's son, and he was talking about this this person that was in his life, or this event that happened in his life, and
wow,
in this lifetime it didn't happen. Like, you know, he was 3 or 4 years old, never been exposed to a person. I can't remember the details of the story, but never exposed to the person whose name it was,
yeah,
or anything like it in this lifetime. Yet he had this like this recollection of that memory. And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, really begs the question: where does that come from?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's just too much evidence, and I think it was Dr. Stevenson, I think, wasn't it? Gosh, I've forgotten his first name now. Who he's gone now, but he did a lot of research in India about that. Because there are children in India are much more right brain, and in certain village cultures, you know, they're not as educated in the left brain. And he actually looked at places where they had birthmarks, and they had this strong. I mean, some of them would run away to be with their mothers, who were strangers who lived, you know, in the next village, and they would run to be with their mothers, and they'd have this big reunion with them, some total stranger, you know. And if they'd been shot in their last life, they had like a birthmark exactly where the wound was. And that was, he did a lot of research on that. It was amazing. There's a lot of his books are out there as well. So there's huge amount of evidence on this, you know. It's like, it's almost, if you really look at the evidence, you just can't deny it. It's extraordinary. And when you listen to little kids, you know, and I've just seen so many little kids do amazing things. How did he know to do that? You know, one of them taught me how to play the piano when he was 4 years old. And the first time he saw a piano, he had his dressing gown on. He just flipped it back like tails and sat down and started playing.
Yeah.
It's amazing, you know. I was like that too with piano when I was really young. I must have been about that age, because I couldn't see the keys. But we visited someone in their house, and they had this big wooden piano, and it was closed. And I knew that there was a lid. I can remember trying to get the lid up. And I remember this big hand coming along. I don't even know who it was. And she opened up, maybe the woman who owned the house, and she opened it up for me. And I remember playing it like this with my hands on the top. Like I could sort of, you know, I knew it was a piano, because I'd worked with piano way back in the 1700s, and clavichords and things. And so it's amazing. So little kids, that, you know, I remember there was also a man who came to, when I used to work in health food stores when I was studying astrology, etc. And a man came in with his little 4-year-old daughter, and she had a little violin case. And I said, "Oh, you play violin?" And she was like really shy. I said, "That's wonderful, you know." And he said, "Yeah, the problem is though that the fingers are so tiny. She likes the tone of the bigger violins." So people think little kids don't have like a musical ear, but they really do, you know. So she already knew that the big ones had a better sound, but her fingers weren't long enough for them.
That's interesting.
It's really amazing. So people just don't realize kids are really super intelligent and really wise.
Yeah.
So, but you know, I could go on and on with those sorts of stories. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. So the end goal, really, the final thing we have to do in life, the thing we're trying to do from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, is master compassion. That's the thing. And that is getting rid of the focus on self and focusing on other. And when someone can come along and murder your family and burn your house down and then stab you in the back, if you turn around and say, "Thank you so much for this valuable lesson. Have a lovely day. Bye," then we don't have to come back anymore. But there's a bit of a trick. There's a catch-22 to this, though, because if you have that much compassion, like the Dalai Lama, for example, why wouldn't you come back? Because, you know, you want to help other people. So there's a little bit of a catch in it. So a lot of old souls do keep coming back. And a lot of great heroes in the world have been like that. You know, they walk into the fires of hell knowing that they might not survive, but they'll do it for others. So, and they're people who just, we call them bodhisattvas in Buddhism, the great awakened beings who just keep coming back. There are a lot of them on the planet. They can be living next door to you. You know, they're people that you don't even know sometimes who have that mission. So we have to really, it's kind of like it's the juxtapose of like the ego, because the ego, the brain is, the game really is that the brain is self-protective. So the brain, we've designed this brain over eons of human development to protect the body and keep it alive and keep it safe and keep the heart pumping and the lungs breathing even when we're sleeping, you know. So it's totally geared to self-survival. And the spiritual consciousness is not. The spiritual consciousness is here to be a benefit to others. It's full of empathy and compassion and great wisdom. And if you listen to that, then you can do amazing things in the world. But if we listen to the ego part of the brain and just run habitually, then we're totally focused on ourselves. And that's when everything gets really hard and everything falls apart, and nothing works like that, because we're all interactive as a species. I remember that as a little girl from Buddhist teachings I'd known way back in other lifetimes, you know. And I remember thinking, gee, if you just look after yourself, then you're totally alone. But if you're actually looking after other people, then all those other people are looking after you. Wouldn't that be lovely? You know, so that was obviously something, a memory of Buddhism, that whole focus.
Yeah.
So that's the final lesson, is compassion. And the interesting thing is, when people start moving in that direction, when they start being more open-hearted in the way they're living their lives, they never go backwards. It's like it's not a fad. It's not like a fantasy. It's like once you have an awakening like that, you don't go back to being a real creep who's just focused on himself or herself. It's like there's a journey that you're on, because it brings so much joy. There's this spiritual joy is different from the sort of joy we get from just the senses, the 5 physical senses. That's not very lasting. It's not durable happiness.
Yeah.
But the joy of compassion is durable happiness. And that's why my work is about exceptional purpose. It's about taking people out of the mundane view of their careers and taking it up to something that can be really useful, and changing. Sometimes it's changing attitude, and sometimes it's changing careers.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, like, if the end goal for the soul is like this lesson of compassion, like, and I know from the work that I've done with you that, what you can discover in a person's chart, gives clues about what their life's purpose may be, or what the vehicle of it, you could say. So if a soul's journey is, striving for compassion or moving towards this lesson of compassion, what really influences the vehicle or the pathway that they go down in this lifetime to learn that lesson? Is there?
You mean sort of astrologically?
Yeah.
It's interesting. That has a lot, I think, to do with the planetoid Chiron, which was discovered in 1977. And all of the new flower essences on the planet were developed from that time onwards. It's amazing. There's and they're all about awakening and spiritual sort of things, which are very different to normal sort of psychological things. And Chiron is, it's sort of, they thought it was a comet at first, because it whizzes up between Saturn and Uranus. It's got a bit of an elliptical orbit, but it's really fascinating, because I think it's in Buddhist terminology, it's called bodhicitta, which is the awakened mind, which is the mind of enlightenment. And enlightenment is when you see reality as being, it's like the movie The Matrix. It's like that whole character that Keanu Reeves was playing. I mean, it's an awakening. And he could do all those magical things because he knew that this 3D world was a manufacture from the other parts of the brain. So he could move beyond that. And they call it a cult Dharma classic, that one. It's really a Buddhist movie in disguise. But that's what it is. And that's why even the Hindus in India, the great siddhas and the great masters, they have that amazing power. So Chiron is like a frequency that stimulates the crown chakra up here, which is they call it the 1,000-petal lotus, all these little energy centers in the brain. And it stimulates this area, and it brings in the thought form of what this life is about, which is always built on the last one. You can't just wipe the slate clean. We're not here to get rid of everything in the brain, because then the brain would be dead for a while while we did that. We had, like changing a motor in a car. You can't do anything with the car when you've got the motor out of it, So it's a bit like that. So the Chiron is trying to rewire things, and it's saying, no, don't be afraid of that. Don't connect this idea with the idea of fear. Let's disconnect those little synapses, put them somewhere else. Yes, it's still a good idea not to jump off a 1,000-foot cliff. So we might connect that with that one. So we don't want to jump off height, So we have all these little things that are legitimate, but we have a lot of things that are no longer legitimate that we think they are. So the Chiron is coming in through the brain and trying to rewire it. And I also have a suspicion that the Chiron energy is that frequency stimulates. There's a particular chemical that washes the brain every night when we get into deep sleep. You have to be in deep sleep for this to happen. And it gets rid of all the old dead neurons and all the sort of bits and pieces and old chemicals and stuff that we're not using, that we don't, that's just an end of the day sort of thing. And it washes the brain clean of all of that. And so we have this fresh sort of clean brain when we wake up in the morning. And if we don't get into that deep sleep, then we miss that kind of process, that's why we feel kind of drowsy and a bit when we haven't had a lot of sleep, or we don't get into that deep phase. So the Chiron does that. And also there's some fascinating work by Dr. Mauro Zapatero, M-A-U-R-O, Zapatero. And he's got some wonderful stuff on YouTube as well. And he's been investigating the cerebrospinal cortex, and also this cerebrospinal fluid, I should say, that runs up and down through the spine, and it runs on the inside and the outside of the spine. And he thinks that is the Kundalini, that the great masters of India have always been speaking about, and especially it goes all the way back to the Vedic teachings of India. And that, I think, is Chiron. It comes in, it runs right through the whole body and right up through that energetic channel, right through all it stimulates all of the hormones in the body and all of the vital electrical systems in the body. So it's quite phenomenal. So I think that's also Chiron. So it has this major effect. And the other interesting part of this that I've always known that the heart, or the sun, that is, the sun and Chiron work together. I've always known that in the chart, because the sun is your heart, and it represents, and there's literally consciousness in your heart, because they've now discovered that there are neurons in the heart and there's intelligence in the heart, just like the brain. It's the same matter as the brain they found in the heart itself. And they've also discovered that the brain sends more the heart sends more signals to the brain than the brain does to the heart. And so that's why the ancients of all cultures have always said the heart is the seat of wisdom. And so, but in the West we go, there, what's that? But it is. I mean, when people say follow your heart, that's what they mean. And I think the heart, because wisdom comes from the past. So I look at this logically. Wisdom is a past thing. It comes from the past. You don't get wisdom from nothing. You get wisdom from experience. So the heart must contain the memory of all the experiences that we want to reinstate in this lifetime. We want to do this again, but it's telling us how to do it safely. Whereas the Chiron comes in with this bodhicitta energy that says, I don't care if we die, the body dies, so what? We just get another one. What's the problem? So the Chiron's got that kind of energy that comes in that says, we're doing this, we're going that way. We've got to change that political system, and we've got to change the way they do that. We've got to rescue those poor little turtles on that island. Whatever it is, it's got this mission that relates to a lot of other lifetimes. We've had this thing we haven't been able to finish. But the heart, if it listens to the heart, if they're connected together, then that's when the wisdom comes through. So the heart brings up the wisdom into the brain, the Chiron brings in the master plan. So, but having said that, the entire chart is a map of your life purpose. So, but the Chiron it's a key, and the symbol looks like a little key, actually. It's a little circle with a little old-fashioned sort of stick and a little sort of side V on it. It looks like one of those really old-fashioned keys in castles and things, So it's an interesting symbol. But so it's the key to that. But there are other things like the midheaven in the chart is the highest point the sun reaches that day when you were born. So it's not where the sun is, but where that point is. And that actually is the whole, that describes your outer life and your inner life, what you're trying to master and bring out through the rising sign, which is what's on the horizon when you're born. There's a frequency of energy just on the eastern horizon. The sun could be anywhere, but whatever's on that eastern horizon when you're born, when you look to the east, that's got a lot to do with the kind of mode you want to work with. Like if it's Gemini, then it's going to be educating and simplifying. And the Sagittarius is going to be bring higher philosophy through for people rather than simplification, or it might do it through music or something like that. And Gemini might do it through the media. So there's a different mode that we have on the ascendant that describes how we're going to put all that wonderful stuff out into the world and how we do it. So the whole chart, there's clues all over the chart. It's a mandala. The astrology chart is a mandala of consciousness. Yeah. And so you can't read it in a linear fashion, unfortunately, because like a mandala, all the pieces fit together. It's all part of one energy. So it's almost like a spiral, the way that it works. Yeah. So it's a really complex thing. It's not simple. It's not something you can learn in a weekend workshop.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Thrive Success Podcast with Daniel Garbett. This has been part 1, and if you want to listen to part 2 of this interview with our guest, you can do so and go deeper into the discussion on the Thrive Academy. Below this podcast, you can access a link where you can claim a 3-day free trial to the Thrive Academy and watch part 2 of this series and be a part of our community.